Yo guys, welcome back to another video. Today we're going to go over the DMO Frozen Orb Wizard build for Season 28. This build guide should remain relevant for future seasons to come, assuming they don't change anything about the set or any of the items that we use. I've really been enjoying this build in Season 28 with all of the power that we get. This build is really fun because it requires a lot of positioning and spacing and just general awareness of the battlefield. Most of my Paragon grinding has been on my Demon Hunter, where I'm just spinning the whole time and it's not really all that engaging, and so this has been a nice way to kind of mix things up. So I will note that this build is okay for Paragon farming, but it is definitely not S tier like that Tal Rasha Meteor build that you could be playing as a wizard. However, if you kind of want to mix things up and just have a good time, I absolutely recommend this build. Let's go ahead and dive into the skills. So we're going to start off with Shock Pulse with Piercing Orb. We are going to be playing Focus and Restraint in this build, at least for the speed running variant. For the pushing variant, you're going to be using a COE and a Halo of Carini with a Ring of Royal Grandeur in the cube. But regardless of which variation you are playing, this is going to be our primary skill. This build takes advantage of the Triumvirate source for the wizard, where our signature spells increase the damage of Arcane Orb by up to 400% for 6 seconds, stacking up to 3 times. For our next skill, you probably could have seen this coming, we're going to go with Arcane Orb and Frozen Orb. This is where all of our damage comes from in this build. So next up, we're going to take Black Hole with Absolute Zero. The big part of this is that we get to group enemies up together, which is really important for how this build plays. So, in addition to that, each enemy hit increases the damage of our cold spells by 3% for 10 seconds. We can hit a massive number of enemies if we have a good map and we position ourselves correctly. Next up, we'll be taking Teleport with Wormhole if you are playing the speedrunning variant. If you are playing the pushing variant, I would recommend going with Safe Passage for additional damage reduction. Don't worry too much about losing Wormhole in the pushing variant because of the 2-piece set bonus that we have here. The cooldown of Teleport is reset when we shoot an enemy with Arcane Orb or our signature spell. Next up, we'll be taking Storm Armor with Power of the Storm, reduces the arcane power cost of all skills while Storm Armor is active, and also activates our Halo of Carini for a massive damage reduction. And lastly, for the skills, we'll be taking Magic Weapon with Deflection. When you perform an attack, gain a protective shield for 3 seconds. It absorbs 4% of your life and damage. This is very nice because we are using Squirt's Necklace in this build, and this is going to protect that buff. And on top of that, the additional 10% increased damage that we get from this definitely doesn't hurt. Moving along to the passives, we're going to take Galvanizing Ward. As long as you've not taken damage in the last 5 seconds, you gain a protective shield that absorbs the next 60% of your life and damage. Again, this is protecting our Squirt's Necklace and just keeping us safe in general. Now for the next one, I'm currently using Prodigy because I've been speed running with this build lately. However, if you are pushing, I would recommend changing this to Elemental Exposure instead. Next up, we're going to be taking Illusionist to occasionally reset the cooldown on our teleport and give us 30% increased movement speed. And lastly, you're going to absolutely want to take Power Hungry. With the way this build plays, you are always going to want to be standing further away from enemies. The way that Frozen Orb works is that the damage is not really dealt by the orb going through the enemy, but rather when it explodes at the very end, you want that explosion to take place on the enemy. That is where your damage is really coming from. Now, to add to the importance of that, we are also using Unstable Scepter in this build, which is increasing the damage of Arcane Orb, and its explosion triggers an additional time. So you're getting 2 explosions on top of an enemy as long as you're positioning yourself correctly to make sure that orb finishes where the enemy is at. Alright, moving along to the gear, we are using 6-piece DMO. First off, let's start with the helm. You are going to want Intelligence, Crit Hit Chance, Arcane Orb damage, and a socket. You can either go with a Topaz or a Diamond, depending on which one you feel benefits you more. If you go ahead and look at the leaderboards for DMO, most people are currently using the Diamond in the helm. However, there are a lot of people choosing to go with the Topaz as well, so whatever you feel fits your playstyle better, I'd say go for that. For the DMO shoulders, you're going to want Intelligence, Vitality. You are not really going to want this armor, you're going to want that area damage, and you're going to want cooldown reduction. For the amulet, we are taking Squirts. You're going to want the cold damage, the crit, and the socket. You're going to want to take a Zay Stone of Vengeance in this because, again, we are going to be standing further away from enemies and taking full advantage of the Zays. For the DMO gloves, Intelligence is okay. I'd rather have attack speed here, but it is hard to roll quadfecta gloves, and so don't feel too bad if you can only get Intelligence. On top of that, you're going to want crit, and area damage if you're pushing, or attack speed if you're doing speed runs. For the chest, once again, DMO, Intelligence, Vitality, Armor, 3 sockets with Topaz. For the wrist slot, we're going to be taking Ashnagar's Blood Bracer, cold damage, Intelligence, Vitality, and crit. Make sure that you get a really solid roll on that secondary stat. It does go from 75 to 100, and there is a big difference between 75 and 100 when it comes to your shields. The shields are not just there to increase our toughness, but rather also to protect our Squirt's necklace, which is a massive component of our overall damage. For the belt slot, I would recommend going with the Shame of Delsere. Signature spells attack 50% faster and restore 12 arcane power. This is incredible for speedruns. However, if you're pushing, I would recommend that instead you go with the Captain Crimson's belt here. Intelligence, Vitality, Armor, and instead of all resist, you would rather get percent life. Alrighty, and for the rings, if you are doing speedruns, you're going to want to go with Focus and Restraint. If you're pushing, you're going to want to go with Convention of Elements and Halo of Carini. The ideal stats that you're going to want for Focus and Restraint would be average damage, crit, and a socket. The jewelry that I recommend taking would be Bane of the Trapped. If you're pushing, take Bane of the Stricken. If you're doing speedruns, go with Bane of the Powerful. If you can't get average damage to roll, that's okay. Intelligence will do just fine. If you're pushing, I would recommend going for either average damage or area damage, and then crit, socket. Moving along to the pants, we're going to be taking DMO again, Intelligence, Vitality, Armor, 2 sockets with Topaz. For the boots, Intelligence, Vitality, Armor, and Arcane Orb damage is essential. For the offhand, we're going to take Triumvirate. Intelligence is fine, crit chance, Arcane Orb damage is especially important, and either Arcane Power on crit or Resource Cost Reduction will do just fine here. Now make sure to keep an eye on the secondary roll, because this goes from 300 to 400 and stacks up to 3 times. So if you get a 300% roll, you are missing up to 300% damage when you're at maximum stacks. This makes a huge difference, and so I would even recommend going with a non-ancient one just to make sure you get a better roll until you can find one that is either ancient or primal with a good secondary roll. For the weapon, we'll take Unstable Scepter, and again, keep an eye on that secondary stat. This is also a massive range from 350 to 450. You're going to want to take 10% damage, intelligence, and attack speed. Romulandi's gift to get a socket in there with an emerald. Now if you're pushing, it's pretty good to replace the intelligence with area damage if you can get that roll. Moving on to the cube, we're going to be taking a wizard spike. Performing an attack has a 25% chance to hurl a frozen orb. Arcane Orb deals 350% increased damage. This is absolutely essential for the build. Next up for the armor slot, we'll take Crown of the Primus. Slow time gains the effect of every rune except Point of No Return. This is incredibly important because with this build, each time we throw out an Arcane Orb or we throw out our signature spell, we're actually going to automatically cast a slow time in the area. Standing in these bubbles is really going to increase your damage and toughness, and it's going to reduce the efficiency of enemies. Slow time is also very nice for the sake of projectiles that are coming at you because it slows them down and makes them incredibly easy to avoid. And for the jewelry slot, we're going to be taking Halo of Carini because this is the speed version. Once again, if you are playing the pushing variant, you're going to want to go with a Ring of Royal Grandeur instead because you're going to be rocking the Captain Crimson set right here as opposed to the Shame of Delsere and just the 6-piece DMO. Now for the follower, I happen to be using the Enchantress right now. However, Maxroll does recommend the Templar, so feel free to kind of play around with each follower and find out which one you like the most. Just ensure that your follower is getting up to 25,000 main stats so that you get the full benefit from each one of their skills. Also make sure that you're getting those essential items that emanate, including the Flavor of Time, Nemesis Bracers, Oculus Ring, and Gloves of Worship. Now before we dive into the gameplay section for this video, I did just want to talk a little bit about the playstyle of this build because it is much more difficult than your average build. It's much more difficult than Tal Rasha Meteor especially, which is what most people are playing. It also has lower potential than the Tal Rasha Meteor, however there are plenty of 150 clears on the leaderboards with DMO, and on top of that the number 1 slot is somebody who's only Paragon level 3800, which is pretty solid for being number 1 on the leaderboards for a specific set. We've also got somebody down here at Paragon 3006 who was cleared with DMO in 13 minutes and 42 seconds. So this build certainly has some power behind it, even though it may not be the best option for the wizard. To get into how you're going to want to play, you're going to want to make sure that the Arcane Orb explosion at the very end, you can see how it explodes twice. You're going to want that to land on the enemy that you're trying to kill. Now the easiest way to do that is to cast a black hole, group up all enemies, and make sure the explosion goes off where you've casted the black hole and you've pulled everything into that location. At the start of the rift, just make sure that you're popping your storm armor and your magic weapon. If you're pushing and it's going to take you longer than 10 minutes to clear the rift, make sure that somewhere around the 5 or 6 minute mark, you're probably going to want to refresh just so that you make sure you've got at least 15 minutes in total on these buffs. Regardless of whether or not you're using focus and restraint, make sure that you are casting your primary skill fairly often, because of course we do have the triumvirate stacks down here. They do last a little bit longer than the focus and restraint buffs. I believe it's about 6 seconds, and so just make sure to keep an eye on it. Make sure you're throwing out your signature spell at least every 6 seconds. All in all, guys, I really think that this is a very fun and engaging build to play, and so I highly recommend that you give it a shot. It is a little bit difficult to gear out because, of course, we do have a lot of rolls that we have to rely on, getting pretty high on those secondary stats. However, it's definitely worth your time if you're looking for a challenge. I'm going to go ahead and throw up some gameplay footage of the last GR120 that I did so that you guys can check this build out. If there's any other build guides that you'd like to see me do, go ahead and let me know down below in the comments. But as always, really appreciate you all for watching. Thank you so much, and I'll catch you on the next one.